Hello, my name is Dr. Xiomara Eni Rivera Pagan, and I am delighted to present to you all today about the following educational language policy, discourse, and spaces for multilingual learners. The purpose of this study is to investigate how educational language policy discourse creates and restricts spaces for multilingual students. So how do the words that we're using in our policies support our multilingual students or restrict spaces for them? We investigated this using a critical theory, and we looked specifically at educational language policy orientations as defined by Hines Clause. And we looked at the definitions restrictive, where the educational language policies are restricting opportunities for multilingual education or multilingual learners. An example of this would be legal prohibitions or curtailments on the use of minority languages, age requirements dictating when a child may or may not study a language. Tolerance orientation, which is a weaker version of promotion orientation, not intended to expand the use of language programming, typically used for short-term accommodations. Or promotion orientation, where the government state agency allocates resources to support the official use of additional languages. So this is looking at dual language programs or two-way immersion programs where the additive language programming policies and programs support multilingual spaces. In addition, this particular study looks at null policies, especially at the beginning of the study, in order to investigate the significant absence of policy recognizing languages or language varieties. And this is key because while a null policy does give space for positive opportunities for an implicit promotion orientation, it does also give space for alternative orientations that are much more implicit. And so it's important to not only recognize the explicit educational language policies, but also start to question the implicit educational language policies. And so we used, the methods that we used are a sample of 290 districts. 35 of the US states were represented, as well as Washington, DC. They were located as they were registered with the Center of Applied Linguistics as dual language or two-way immersion programs. And then each of those districts' websites were visited in order to identify the educational language policies for that particular district. The explicit educational language policies were then downloaded and they were coded according to the orientations described earlier. Then the keywords English and bilingual were investigated in terms of frequency, collocation, and concordances in order to investigate how often the words were used, the placement of those words, and how those keywords and the placement added meaning in order to investigate not only through quantitative means, but also through qualitative means. And so once the educational language policies were downloaded and they were coded, they basically broke down into these initial ELP, or educational language policy orientations. And so we have over a quarter that were identified as null policies, so that is lack of explicit educational language policy. Then 21% were restrictive. 38% were identified as tolerance orientation according to overall objectives. Promotion, there were 12% that were identified as promotion according to overall objectives. And the way that they were coded was the actual words and the objectives were identified, and the predominant objectives place them within one of these particular orientations. If there were equal amounts of two different orientations, then they were unidentified, and there were 6 educational language policies out of the 290 that were unidentified. After they were initially coded, we needed to investigate further whether or not to see if there were any patterns in terms of the corpus linguistics analysis that could give us more insight into this initial coding. And so we looked at the keywords of bilingual and English. And in looking at the keywords of bilingual and English, you'll see that the relative frequency of bilingual increases from restrictive to promotion. It's far greater in promotion than it is in restrictive and intolerance. There's also an increase in the dispersion of the use of the keyword bilingual from one orientation all the way to promotion orientation. We see that there's a significant use of English, which is not surprising within all of the orientations or all of the texts that were identified with these particular orientations. However, it is important to notice that restrictive and tolerance have over 300, and promotion had far less compared to both restrictive and tolerance. It's also really important to notice that the difference between the use of English to the use of bilingual within restrictive and tolerance is far greater than the difference between the use of English and bilingual in promotion orientation. The same thing with the dispersion. It's almost in 100% of the text in English, which makes sense because it's the dominant language. However, there's a significant use of the phrase bilingual as well. So there's more of a balance in the conversation between these two keywords in promotion orientation than there is in the other 2 orientations that were identified. When we look at the one-way ANOVA in order to investigate whether or not those initial statistical findings were statistically significant, we see that when we look at the keyword bilingual, that they are statistically significant, and clearly so throughout all of the orientations. When we look at English use between restrictive and tolerance, there is not a statistical significance, but there is a statistical significance between the use of promotion and tolerance, promotion and restrictive, or all of the educational language policies, and the way that the promotion-oriented text is using English. So that is key as well. When we look further in order to see how in use these keywords are being used, we look at the key phrase English learner because it's used throughout all of the educational language policy texts. And the way that English learner is used within restrictive, tolerance, and promotion is different. And we see that there are key phrases and key objectives within these orientations that align with the orientations as identified by Heinz-Claus originally. And so the restrictive is more, uses phrases and words and objectives that are subtractive. For example, for the purposes of overcoming language barriers. Tolerance orientation has more of a rights-oriented objective, for example, made in compliance with, versus a promotion orientation that aligns with a additive approach in which space is created for the dominant language, English, as well as for additional languages, bilingual, or creating opportunities for multilingual students. So in conclusion, we see that there are identification of linguistic markers within each of the orientations, and we see that explored at a quantitative as well as a qualitative level. We see that semantic patterns for creating restrictive spaces for multilingual students or English language learners can be further explored. And the explicit and intentional use of terms that encourage bilingual or multilingual education allow for an additive approach towards English language acquisition and home language maintenance. Implications are that identifying the consequences of tolerance or restrictive orientation, creating a covert cycle of restrictive access and perpetuating monolingual ideology with potential negative academic achievement and limited opportunity for EL students or multilingual students. Promotion-oriented educational language policies with language as a right or language as a resource ideology is imperative if multilingual students are to be valued and supported linguistically as well as academically. And this gives us an opportunity to evaluate our own multilingual ideological orientations in order to explore how we are advocating for spaces for multilingual education or multilingual learners. If you would like to discuss any of these topics or ask any questions, I highly encourage you. I would love to speak further about anything that I presented on. And if you would just like some more information on what I discussed, you can visit the website on the page. I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful day.